Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 199. This week the questions are taken from guide 246 to the never built Malta class carriers and the Wednesday video on the development of US Navy tactics 1895 to 1939, which was of course an interview with the absolutely wonderful Trent Hone. So let's get stuck in. Night Heron Productions asks, with a 4-inch armoured flight deck as built, what would a late-era Malta aircraft group look like? I'd imagine similar to Ark Royal's final air group with E2s instead of Gannets, but could F-14s have made it into the hangars if they'd lasted long enough, providing the lifts could be altered to accommodate them? You're definitely not looking at F-14s. The last iteration of the design that went in for the Maltas was a fraction smaller, albeit about the same displacement as a Midway. The previous iteration was almost exactly the same size as a Midway, so you can look at the Midways for some guidance as to what they probably would have carried, and the Midways didn't carry the F-14s. They physically could, and as I found out while I was on Midway, it was technically possible to land an F-14 and get one back off again, but that was at the very, very extreme edges of the performance for the type. So a hypothetical late-era air group for the Midways, or for the Maltas, sorry, should probably be still, Royal Navy issue Phantoms and Buccaneers, most likely, along with, obviously, as you said, all the ancillary aircraft. But in terms of strike and fighters, it's going to be F4s and Buccaneers, maybe F4s and Harriers towards the end of the life cycle, although, the Buccaneer is technically a better strike aircraft than the Harrier, but the Harrier would have been new at the time, albeit that there is a very, very slight, and I do stress very slight, possibility that you might, if the Maltas had lasted into the early 90s, i.e. the end of the Cold War, you might have seen some very late era navalized Tornado air defense variants, the Tornado F3s. They're big aircraft, they're big twin engine aircraft, but they have swing wings, which makes them a bit better at short takeoffs, kind of like the F-14. But they are, believe it or not, for an aircraft that was lengthened from a strike aircraft, still a bit smaller and a bit lighter than an F-14. So it might have been pushing an upgraded Malta's performance envelope out to the very, 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 very limits, but in a hypothetical, wondrous scenario in which the Royal Navy had retained at least a couple of Maltas well into the 1980s, it is entirely possible that the Royal Navy, when the air defense variant of the Tornado was being discussed, might have turned around and said, you know what, actually we want in on this as well. And given that the air defense version of the Tornado came into service in the late 1980s, that might have then been something that the Royal Navy went for. Granted that at that point they would have known from age, apart from anything else, that the Maltas were on their way out. But from a naval perspective, if you've just gone through the expense of getting a bunch of navalized Tornado F3s, it does kind of box the government in a little bit into what size your replacement carrier is going to be. Mr. Grevenar asks, how long would it take to draw up an initial or adopted design for a carrier like the Malta, since this was during wartime? Is the peacetime process slower? So, for the Maltas to go from we need a big aircraft carrier to here's a design we can build in wartime took about a year and a half. It then got extended, but this is kind of the problem with wartime. In wartime, it is entirely possible to come up with full-fledged designs fairly quickly. Say, a year and a half to design something this size, especially at that time, is just, it's mind-boggling from a peacetime perspective. The problem, which is part of what actually happened to the Maltas, is that when you have an extended war going on, you also have wartime lessons, and that was in some ways the downfall of the Maltas. If the design that had been come up with by October 43 had been built, okay, it probably wouldn't have been as good as Design X or Design X1, but it would have been built. Whereas once they had wartime experience, especially considering the time period, late 43, lessons from various American carrier fights in mid to late 42 and early 43 would have been fully digested by that point. Then the Admiralty is going, right, yeah, there are some rather significant war-induced changes we need to make. And then the design was revised, again, and it then went to from about a year and a half to 2.5 to 3 years, and then by the time the final design revisions had been made, it was too late. The war was effectively over, and no further work was done on it. So in the peacetime process, you don't have, obviously, incoming wartime lessons, so you're not going to have to make massive changes at the last possible moment. The flip side to that is, obviously, there's a lot less pressure in peacetime to get ships out there ASAP, and if we're going to be blunt, a lot more incentive from defense contractors to, should we say, extend the design time. And, with slightly less money, they're also going to put less people on it anyway. So yeah, the peacetime design process for carriers is going to be slower unless somebody turns around and decides we're going to treat this as if it's a war situation, i.e. an emergency procurement option. At which point, money and resources put in, similar to levels to wartime, you can get a similar kind of result to wartime in terms of a sort of 1.5 to 2 years, but more typically the design of a large carrier, at least at that kind of time period, 40s, 50s, is going to be normally between 3 and 5 years, assuming you don't make any major changes. Unit 0 asks, what are your thoughts on Geoffrey Spicer-Simson, or Lord Bellycloth? How could someone so eccentric be given command of a Royal Navy expeditionary force, and was the whole thing worth the time and effort put into it, given how it turned out? Oh, if you want eccentricities in a Royal Navy officer, this guy has nothing on some of them, to be perfectly honest. In terms of exactly why he was given command of the Royal Navy side of the Lake Tanganyika expedition, which is something I will have to cover eventually, essentially it was seen as a sideshow of a sideshow of a sideshow. It was locally very important, but for the Admiralty in London, the primary theatre was the North Sea, obviously with the High Seas Fleet First Scouting Group to counter. The secondary theatre was the Atlantic, the tertiary theatre was the Channel, the quaternary theatre was the Mediterranean, the quinquennary theatre was everywhere else that was ocean and, had ships in it that the British could trade with and, the enemy could disrupt. The sextenary theatre was probably the more enclosed seas like the Red Sea and so forth, and areas that were by that point completely dominated by friendly ships and unlikely to see any hostile incursions, like the Western Pacific, where you had Russia, Japan, Britain, France, etc., basically all in control after von Spee had left. So you're going all the way down to kind of like a heptanary theatre when you're talking about a random lake in the middle of Africa. So at that point, the Navy wasn't really looking for anybody particularly skilled and in terms of command, or particularly notable in terms of command. And when they came across him, they looked at him and went, well, he knows both of the local languages and he's served in Africa before. He's of the vaguely appropriate rank. I guess we send him. He has some applicable skills. And as I said, as far as eccentricities go, the Royal Navy was surprisingly tolerant of them all through the 19th century and well into the 20th century. It basically would only be when you got to the middle of the Cold War and everyone settled down into a relatively peaceable routine without being pulled pillar to post by various odd global conflicts and lesser imperial conflicts, as is the tradition with most peacetime navies, the Royal Navy just kind of started to get a little bit stricter on those kinds of things. As far as, was the whole thing worth the time and effort given how it turned out? Yeah, probably. If he hadn't taken the expedition there and accomplished what he did, then that aspect of the war probably would have gone somewhat worse for the Allies. But at the same time, it is kind of more of a point of pride thing, because whatever happened there, it wasn't going to save Germany on the Western Front. But from a morale perspective and from just a general principle perspective of not having to, in any kind of negotiation, cede anything in return for the hostile power giving something back, it was probably worth it in the long term. Chuck Griffin asks, if the Malta class had been built, is it likely they would have modified them to have an angled flight deck like the Midway class was? And would this have influenced Royal Navy aviation to go long-term with conventional fixed-wing aircraft rather than VTOL or STOL aircraft? So, similar to what I mentioned in the first question, yes, a midway-sized carrier like Malta almost certainly would have been modified. They tried to do that. To the whole Royal Navy fleet, the whole HMS Victorious refit really didn't work out. But in a scenario where the Maltas are built, as I mentioned in various previous dry docks, the illustrious class, no matter what good condition they're in, are not going to last, nor really will the implacable. So the Royal Navy is almost certainly going to be left over with a mixture of majestic, courageous Centaur Bulwark types, some Audaciouses, and the Maltas, with those smaller carriers being gotten rid of much, much faster. So, yes, at that point, if the Royal Navy has large flight deck fleet carriers, it is going to modify them. It's probably not going to be quite as bad, given the design specs of the Maltas, as it was modifying Victoria, so it's a fairly good chance that multiple of those carriers get modified. And then, yes, the Royal Navy is going to be sticking with conventional aircraft for its carriers for a fairly long time to come. And since they have both larger carriers, therefore they can have more aircraft, so they can order more aircraft in the first place, and they're more useful, it's much more likely that, well, it's relatively likely that they are going to continue development of native built, if you want to use that term, aircraft. So the F4K was brought in part thanks to the government white paper, not entirely, but in part thanks to the government white paper murdering the British local aircraft industry. That may still happen, so it may still be F4Ks and Buccaneers, but with multiple large flight decks going into the 70s and 80s with a much longer lifespan on them, because bear in mind they knew that Ark Royal and Eagle were kind of on their last legs once they were getting into the 70s, similar to what we talked about in last week's dry dock. It's much more likely that the Royal Navy would be able to persuade somebody to part with some cash for something in the early to mid 70s for a new generation fixed wing fighter. Now, whether that would have been following on from the F4K and maybe buying into the very early FA-18 program, or whether they would have perhaps provided more impetus to the Tornado program, because both the FA-18 and the Tornado are products of the 1970s, which is roughly when the Royal Navy would have started looking for a replacement for the F4s. Except that obviously one is, we've already bought American carrier fighters, the Americans are going to buy a lot of whatever their next carrier fighter is, let's get in on that. It's kind of similar to what's happened with the F-35. Or it could be, the Tornado is our latest and greatest European cooperative measure, and the spec for the Tornado ADV was actually issued quite soon after the first flights of the Strike Tornadoes, so that maybe would have put a bit more impetus on that, and maybe the Tornado Air Defence variant would have been pushed forward, in which case, instead of getting Tornado ADVs in the late 1980s as a way of effectively blackmailing the government into building something about as large for a future Malta replacement project, maybe the Tornado ADVs would have been built earlier, and they could have seen maybe 10-15 years service life on the Maltas. I mean, it's still going to kind of blackmail the government into buying something similar size in the mid-90s, but it would have been, at the time at least, more of a decision about updating the air wing rather than anything else. And in fact, if that hypothetical scenario did take place, it actually provides slightly more impetus for the Invincibles actually still coming into commission, believe it or not, but maybe 2 rather than 3 in terms of a companion escort for the Maltas, because at that point, if you do have a potential of operating what is still going to be a very large and heavy fighter in the form of the Tornado Air Defence variant, you're going to want as much space as possible on the Maltas, at which point the Invincibles might start looking like a good idea in terms of offloading a good chunk of the helicopter wing of a Malta onto an Invincible to conduct dedicated anti-submarine warfare to free up more space for bigger, nicer aircraft aboard the Maltas. Of course, all of this assumes that the existence of the Maltas, and in theory their theoretical achievements in the 50s, 60s and early 70s, might then persuade the government that actually the Royal Navy having fixed-wing aircraft is a good idea generally, and having carriers is a good idea generally, as opposed to, as mentioned last week, them for some bizarre reason deciding that the Royal Navy should be better known as NATO's first ASW flotilla. Somebody whose name is going to be impossible to pronounce asks, I have heard that 6-inch guns, even in dual-purpose mounts, are substantially less effective in the anti-aircraft role than the 5-inch due to their slower tracking and reloading for a shell that's most likely not going to explode anywhere near its target anyway. Is this true? And if so, with hindsight, would vessels armed with 6-inch dual-purpose guns have been better off with 5-inch dual-purpose guns in World War II, sacrificing surface bombardment firepower for anti-aircraft firepower? If you're talking, and by the context of the question I think you are, about pre-World War II designs, then yes, the 5-inch dual-purpose mount was far superior to the 6-inch dual-purpose mount. There really isn't a 6-inch dual-purpose mount during the Second World War. Obviously, you can see here the Worcester class's 6-inch dual-purpose firing off, but they are immediately post-warship. Notionally, a variety of 6-inch guns were capable of being used in an anti-aircraft role, but practically, as you mentioned, the more so the tracking than the reloading element. I mean, the reloading element doesn't help, but more so the tracking element really made them unsuitable for use against aircraft. And there's a whole slew of things. Obviously, there's the rate of tracking, there's the rate of elevation, there's also whether or not you can load the gun at all angles, because if you can't, then the gun needs to come down to be reloaded, then it needs to go back up again. And if all of that is happening just a bit slower than a 5-inch mount with a 6-inch mount, and you've got this extra up and down for reloading, it's going to massively cut into your rate of fire. And even with VT fuses, for the bulk of the Second World War, just chucking as much steel down range at something approximating the correct angle and elevation was more important than an individually more powerful shell. Towards the end, once radar-guided fire control really got going, precision and range became somewhat more important. But yeah, for the bulk of World War II, the 5-inch dual purpose is a far superior weapon. Now, as to whether or not ships with notionally dual-purpose 6-inch guns would have been better off with 5-inch guns, that is a much more difficult one to answer, because almost all ships with notionally dual-purpose 6-inch guns got into a fair amount of surface action. 1942 Guadalcanal campaign, especially for the US Navy, and then the Solomon Islands campaign thereafter. The Royal Navy, pretty much for the entire duration of the European side of the conflict, although more so up until 1943. So, a Leander or an Arethusa or a Town with 5-inch guns, no. They needed those 6-inch guns for the punch that they delivered when they ended up in a fair amount of surface combat. The Brooklyns, likewise, a fair number of those ended up in combat with various Japanese vessels, and they had fairly fast-firing triple 6-inch. Triple anything in the anti-aircraft role usually doesn't seem to work out very well, especially at the larger dual-purpose gun calibers, because of the complications in loading, and obviously triple turret is much heavier to slew around. So quite what you could have done with a Brooklyn, if you wanted practical dual-purpose fire with 5-inch guns, sticking dual 5s on it, yeah, sure, you could have done something that resembled a Super Atlanta, which, to be honest, would have been slightly amusing, but you would be looking at overwhelming a target with sheer firepower, sheer in numbers of shots, which works to an extent right up until you run up against someone that's got any kind of decentish armour. So whilst I would say that, yes, the 5-inch dual-purpose mount definitely is a superior weapon for anti-aircraft use, for most cases where ships were built with 6-inch guns, either in the run-up to or during World War II, I think they were better off with the 6-inch guns because of the other roles that they had to fulfill. The only place where you could potentially make some kind of argument against that would be in the later, for the British Crown colonies and for the Americans, the Clevelands. But even then, I wouldn't necessarily want to go with a 5-inch 38. You'd want maybe something like a 5-inch 54 or similar long barrel 5-inch gun, which might be somewhat better for their use in the latter part of the war when they're purely facing anti-aircraft actions, but that is using a heck of a lot of hindsight. UNSC Forward Onto Dawn asks, you mentioned in your video on the Town class light cruiser that the class were originally built to a 9,000-ton design in order to get more ships out of Britain's allocated cruiser tonnage under the naval treaties. Was any consideration given to doing something similar with the new battleships, i.e. 6 29,000-ton ships instead of 5 35,000-ton ships? And if the British had gone down that route, given the British design philosophy of the time, what would they have looked like and how would they have performed during World War II? So whilst 29,000 tons exactly was not looked at by the British in the 1930s, they did look at a number of designs that almost exactly straddle that line. So they looked at 28,000-ton designs for 12-inch battleships, which gives you some idea of just how far things had come in terms of, the need for the weight that was imposed by larger secondary batteries and so forth. So at 28,000 tons, you could get something like what you can see in the picture, which is a 3 triple turret 12-inch design with an extensive 12-gun 4.7-inch battery. That's sort of 12 twin mounts for 4.7-inch guns, so 12 guns per side. And there were variations on that, twin-turreted versions and so forth. And then you had on the 30,000-ton side, there were designs with triple 14-inch, which pretty much would have been very similar, but just with bigger guns, with the caveats that these designs were usually 23 knotters. There were a couple of designs for a 14-inch gunship that could do 25 to 28 knots. There are a couple of designs for a 12-inch gunship that could do 25 to 28 knots. But these obviously added 1,000 or 2,000 tons more. So, if for some reason you wanted to build 6 29,000-ton ships with armour that would at least protect them against the bulk of weapons available at the time, not all of them, obviously, especially with 16 and 18-inch guns coming into the field in the latter part of the 1930s and early 1940s in things like 16-inch 50s and the Japanese Yamatos, you could maybe get a fast 12-inch gun battleship on that displacement. I mean, looking at the displacement of the Alaskas, they're pretty much dead on the money. About 29,000 ton standard displacement, 12-inch guns, high speed, and, well, see the Alaska class video for what their armour and torpedo defences were. Now, if you dialed the speed down to, say, 28 knots to create a battleship, you probably could save enough on hull length and displacement to put in an actual working torpedo defence system and up the armour to maybe 12 or 13 inches. but that's pretty much all you would have gotten out of it. So which is pretty reflective of what the British design studies found. If they'd gone with that, how would they have performed during World War II? Probably pretty terribly, to be perfectly honest. I mean, Scharnhorst would have had a fighting chance against one of those things. So a hypothetical 29,000-ton 12-inch Duke of York going up against Scharnhorst. Scharnhorst might still have turned to run because she was being hemmed in by all the cruisers and so forth, but in a direct one-on-one, she'd be actually in a far better position to potentially win that fight. And then you think of the other engagements the King George V got involved in. Now, to be fair, not too many of them, but a 12-inch Prince of Wales, yeah, you're not sending that with Hood up against Bismarck and Prince Eugen, not unless you're absolutely confident that Hood has a superiority over Bismarck one-on-one. Because admittedly, it was the 12-inch Prince of Wales would have a superiority against Prince Eugen one-on-one. But as I said before, the British aren't interested in a fair fight. They sent what they thought were 2 battleships up against a battleship and a cruiser because that was an unfair fight. Whereas, Hood and a 12-inch Prince of Wales against Bismarck and Prince Eugen is actually approaching a fair fight in a way that would be very uncomfortable for the Royal Navy. And in that case, King George V would also be a 12-inch ship. So, yeah, not good. Not good at all. So, yeah, I don't think they would have done very well. It certainly would have given the Germans a lot more confidence, because in things like Operation Berlin, it would have meant the only ships the British could possibly send to intercept them that could both catch them and then fight them would either be Hood, Renown, or Repulse, or these things, which I said would have been on a much more of an even keel in terms of fight potential. So, yeah, a very, very good idea that they didn't go down that route. I suspect you probably would have seen 2 or 3 of them badly damaged or sunk in various surface actions or indeed air defence actions, because you can't get quite as much secondary battery on 29,000 tons as you can on 35, nor as much protection against bombs, so they would have been much more vulnerable to air attack as well. Zachary asks, could you spare a word for Philo McGiffin? He was a naval advisor during the First Sino-Japanese War. Do you think the Beiyang fleet could have achieved victory over the combined fleet if it had support from the other Qing fleets and were given proper training and funding prior to the conflict? How bad was the problem with corruption? I've heard of the naval budget going to pleasure craft and problems with ammunition quality control. Well, if ever there was a man given a hopeless task, it was Philo McGiffin. As you mentioned, he was American advisor, technically the first American to command a battleship in combat, albeit it was a Chinese one. Now, taking the other parts into isolation, if the Beiyang fleet had had support from the other 3 Chinese fleets, would it have made a difference? Not really. The sum total of useful contributions that the other 3 fleets could have made amounted to a couple of small cruisers, 1 questionable small cruiser, and a handful of torpedo boats or torpedo gunboats. The latter are not going to make a tremendous amount of difference to the main battle line engagement, and 2, possibly 3 small cruisers likewise are not going to tip the balance of the Battle of the Yalu River. Now, as far as the problem with corruption, the Battle of the Yalu River, as I've said a number of times in various Drydocks, remains a much debated and argued over battle with relatively poor sourcing available. There's a number of sources, but to a degree they are contradictory. Some themes can be pulled from it, but yeah, it's a bit of a mess. Anyway, as far as how bad corruption was and how much that affected, that is a much, much, much bigger factor. The Beiyang fleet, on paper, had a number of advantages and a few disadvantages over the Japanese fleet. They had numbers, they had, in theory, firepower, they did have more big guns, and some of the Japanese bigger guns were malfunctioning. However, on average, the Chinese ships were older and didn't possess as many quick-firing guns, and in the 1880s and 1890s, quick-firing guns could make quite a difference to a battle. So if you assumed all other things were equal, the Chinese should have been able to pummel the Japanese quite badly as the Japanese closed the range. And then if the Japanese ships were still in fighting condition by the time they got close up, then they would have the advantage. But it would be possible for the Japanese to actually lose the fight or be well on their way to losing the fight before they got into that range. And even once they got into that range, if they were quite battered from the run-in, it would be entirely possible again that a number of their quick-firing guns might have been disabled, and then superior big-gun Chinese firepower could have brought the Japanese fleet down. So there were quite a number of potential avenues to victory, all other things being equal, for the Beiyang fleet. The problem was all other things were not equal. There was a degree of insubordination going on. There certainly was a lot of corruption going on. The wrong ammo, old gunpowder, ammunition that with the explosives have been siphoned off for sale and filled with inert substances, and as a result of all of that, and pay and such being siphoned away as well, not enough training for the crew. And it is one of those cases, a little bit like the 2nd Pacific Squadron, where the quality of the crews in and of themselves, once the action gets going, is not bad. The Chinese ships by the Battle of Yalu River do fight very hard, a few corrupt officers notwithstanding. But everything else means that just a will to fight doesn't save them from the Japanese, much in the same way that while Rossosvensky himself was a very, very good admiral for his time, and whilst the Russian ships in the Battle of Tsushima fought very hard and did reasonably well, considering the state that they had been in when they left the Baltic, the flip side is in both cases there were so many fundamental underlying problems with the ships generally, and with some of their supplies, and with the general state of training that the crews had had in the first place, that it wasn't anywhere close to enough to overcome things. So in a hypothetical scenario where the Beiyang fleet was supplied with enough money and non-corrupt officers both ashore and in the fleet, and officers that actually listened to their admiral, and a slightly more comprehensive battle plan, they would have had a much better than even chance of seeing off the Japanese. But it wasn't to be. Leap of Faith 97 asks, what would you say were the relative strengths and weaknesses of the three major carrier powers, Japan, UK and US, compared with one another in 1939? And which one of those powers did the most to address their shortcomings in carrier tactics, doctrine and technology over the course of the war? So the situation in 1939 is very different to the one you'd find at the end of 1941 and technically the beginning of 1942, which is when Japan and the US actually start going at each other. So you could look at, I guess, very broadly speaking, the ships, the doctrine and the aircraft. And this, to be fair, this question has given me the excuse to make this chart, which I've been wanting to make for ages but never gotten around to. Forgive the fact it's slightly crude, but you get the general idea. So, ships-wise, the UK is both ahead and behind of everybody else. The British have 7 carriers compared to everybody else having 6. So the British have Argus, Hermes, Eagle, Courageous, Glorious, Furious and Ark Royal, and they have 4 more carriers that are going to be commissioned in the next 2 years. We're talking here about fleet carriers, or at least what counted for fleet carriers at the time of their launch, in the case of some of the smaller aircraft carriers, which is of course the 4 Illustrious class. Well, 3 Illustrious is an Indomitable, kind of a half-sister. So anyway, so the British have 7 carriers that were fleet carriers at the time of their launch, with another 4 due to come online, for a total projected fleet within the next 2 years of 11. The Americans have 6 carriers, so 1 less, Langley, Lexington, Saratoga, Ranger, Yorktown and Enterprise, and they have 2 due to come online in the next couple of years, that being Wasp and Hornet. And the Japanese also have 6 carriers, Hosho, Akagi, Kaga, Rugyo, Soryu and Hiryu, with the 2 Shikakus due to come online in the next 2 years. So looking at that, you're going to think, oh, well, the British have the advantage. They're going to have 11 to everybody else's 8, and they have a one-hull superiority now. All fine and dandy. But then you actually have to look at the actual capabilities of what is now currently a viable fleet carrier. You can write off thing for the Japanese, say Hosho. Yep, she's not really by any stretch a fleet carrier by this point. Rugio is likewise more capable than Hosho, but still quite lacking in the air group department. So that leaves the Japanese with Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu as true fleet carriers, with the Shokakus coming online, so that's 4, total 6 soon. The Americans, you can write off Langley, but actually they have Lexington, Saratoga, Yorktown, and Enterprise, so they have 4 similar to the Japanese. Ranger, as has been said, she was something of the black sheep of the US fleet carrier family, but she can still carry a lot of aircraft. She might be slightly slower, she might be slightly more vulnerable, but, come down to brass tacks, she is still a viable fleet carrier, if a slightly explodey one. Same thing could be said for Wasp. So the Americans realistically have 5 full-size or near full-size fleet carriers, at least by air group, with another 2 due to come. So that gives them 7. So they've got a one carrier advantage over the Japanese. And then you look at the British. Argus and Hermes, definitely not fleet carriers by this point. Eagle, probably also not. I mean, she's got a decent-ish air group, but if we're going to exclude Rugio, you probably also need to exclude Eagle. She's also not exactly the fastest. She would give good service in the Second World War, but let's face it, she isn't a full-size fleet carrier at this point. You then have, the British are then left with Courageous, Glorious, Furious, and Ark Royal. So 4, maybe that sounds decent compared to the Japanese also having 4. But then of those, at least air group wise, Ark Royal is the only one that comes close to competing. Courageous and Glorious are not awful. Furious, however, has a 1 squadron less aircraft compared to Courageous and Glorious, thanks to her design choices back when she was built. And then you obviously have the armoured carriers coming along, so that kind of helps in terms of hull numbers. They don't have the world's biggest air groups, but they are very durable, as we've also discussed. So when it comes to actually putting aircraft into the skies, and if you're looking at the pre-war carriers, especially with the Courageouses, their durability as well, the British are behind carrier-wise in almost everything other than, as I say, sheer hull numbers. Although their immediate outlook is somewhat brighter, because they've got 4 fleet carrier hulls coming down the slipways when everyone else only has 2. And interestingly enough, of those carriers that are coming down the slipways or on the stocks in 1939, the 4 illustriouses would survive. Shikaku, Zuikaku, Wasp, and Hornet would all be destroyed within a year of their respective nations entering the war. Then you look at aircraft, which is where this lovely chart comes in, and it is a little bit of a turnabout for the books, because there is no denying that by late 1941, both the Japanese and the Americans were well ahead in the realms of carrier-borne aircraft. But as you can see from here, the sampling of the latest and greatest aircraft currently in service with the respective air arms of the respective fleets in 1939, and, well, the picture isn't looking quite so good. The UK has mono-wing retractable undercarriage fighters and dive bombers, although the Skewer likes to also cosplay as a fighter, to questionable effect. The Rock is a turret fighter, so there's also some question there as to its effectiveness, but performance-wise and technology-wise, compared to everybody else, they're not terrible. The US is still using the F-3F biplane fighter, and the original flavour Curtiss Helldiver, also a biplane dive bomber. The Japanese are using the A5M. Now, it is a monoplane fighter, true. However, it still has a fixed undercarriage, so it's kind of a technological halfway house. Albeit, as you can see, the F3F actually has a retractable undercarriage. And dive bomber-wise, they are also using a biplane dive bomber. So Then we get onto the torpedo bombers, and this is where you have the slightly odd juxtaposition in that the Japanese in 39 are using the B5N1, not the B5N2, but it's still a monoplane torpedo bomber. The British are using the biplane Swordfish, and the Americans are using the monoplane Devastator, which, for all its faults at Midway, in 1939 is still a modern monoplane torpedo bomber. So you can make a decent argument that in 1939, the British are ahead in 2 out of the 3 fields of the carrier-based aircraft game, and behind in the torpedo bomber field. Now, if it comes fighting for second place, I would probably just about give it to Japan. The A5M is firepower aside probably a notionally slightly more advanced aircraft than the F3F, and the B5N, whether it be in the 1 or the 2 variant, is again arguably a superior aircraft to the Devastator. The dive bombers, okay, I'll give you that one, but 2 out of 3 ain't bad. So far, carrier-based hulls, realistically the Americans have the advantage in 39, followed by the Japanese, and then the British, although, as I said, immediate future and absolute flight deck numbers give a slightly distorted view of that, which make the British seem a little bit stronger than they are. Aircraft-wise, however, the British are probably in the lead, followed by Japan and then the US. And then we have doctrine. Now, doctrine is a bit of an interesting one because everyone has lovely doctrines on paper and then promptly almost always fails to execute them in practice or finds massive flaws with them. The Japanese wouldn't adopt their Kirobutai-style massed carrier group doctrine, which, to be fair, was probably the most advanced that anybody had in 1941 until 1940, or late 41, late 40 or early 41, depending on exactly whose sources you read. At which point, the Japanese are in this weird position of they still have the independent carrier operating doctrine, much as the USA does, but the Japanese have some wartime experience because they've been fighting the Sino-Japanese War. Admittedly, obviously, that doesn't give them World War II scale of combat experience, but they have combat experience, period. The Americans are very much, again, also of the single carrier on its own doctrine. They are of the belief that if a carrier is found, it will die, so it's best to spread them out, because then at least if the enemy finds one carrier, you only lose one carrier and not all of them. But both the US and Japan do believe in putting out some fairly large strike groups, relatively speaking, from their carriers. Their ability to do so is sometimes a little bit at odds with the doctrine, but the doctrine is there. Whereas the British are doctrinally probably the most advanced in that their doctrine at least calls for multiple carriers to operate together to launch larger strike groups. The flip side being, of course, that when they actually go to war, their carriers end up split hither and yon all over the place, at which point small packs of aircraft that are designed to be sent off from a carrier to form part of an overall decent-sized strike package end up on their own being actually a relatively small strike package. So, yeah, whether or not that's a aspect of war itself, and you have to take into account war in 1939 because obviously September 1939 is when the Royal Navy gets stuck into World War II. If the British had been fighting a Pacific War, they probably could have concentrated their carriers, but in reality they fighting in and around Europe they didn't, and so the doctrine kind of fell over a little bit, whereas obviously, as we said, the Japanese changed their doctrine between 1939 and 1940, and the Americans kept to their doctrine, at least initially, but obviously the Pacific being a very different operating environment, it had some success. They did change it as well after wartime lessons, but it worked to a degree. So it is a little bit difficult to make a full assessment on doctrine, because as I said, the Royal Navy had a doctrine but then weren't able to execute it because of circumstances. The Japanese changed their doctrine, so we don't know exactly how their old doctrine would have performed in wartime because they never actually got a chance to practice it. And the Americans, the only ones who did get a chance to basically carry their 39 doctrine into 41 and 42, but against an enemy who had a completely different doctrine by that point. So again, ranking effectiveness of doctrines in 39 is somewhat difficult. As far as which power did the most to address their shortcomings in carrier tactics, doctrine, and technology over the course of the war, well, I think if you divide it into two sections, so the early part of the war, 39, 40, 41, up to the end of 1941, the Japanese, probably, because they completely overhaul their offering of aircraft. Even the B-5N model that's flying in late 41 is different from the one that was in 39. They obviously, as we just said, massively overhauled their tactics, their doctrine. Well, their doctrine and their tactics. So from 39 to 41, the Japanese are the ones that most address their shortcomings. But over the course of the entire war, the Americans are the ones who, obviously, they improve their tactics the most. They radically change their tactics completely. Likewise, their doctrine completely radically shifts, and their technology obviously comes on in leaps and bounds as well. The British being hamstrung slightly by having to fight for 2.5 years before everybody else. They do upgrade their technology a fair bit, obviously. They are forced to change their doctrine because they can't do their pre-war doctrine at all. Their tactics do take a significant uptick, but again, they are forced to scramble between developing tactics for 4 different theatres. And the Japanese, well, they go into the war at the end of 1941, arguably with the strongest combination of tactics, doctrine, and technology, but it's very much a glass cannon that then gets rather radically smashed, and they are physically unable to do all that much doctrinally towards the end of the war, other than coming up with interesting and clever ways of getting single bombers through an otherwise impenetrable screen. Paige Jackson asks, in his book Jutland, author Nicholas Jellicoe mentioned that it was the construction of HMS Dreadnought which made the famous naval race between Britain and Germany in the early 20th century possible, as HMS Dreadnought rendered British naval power, which depended on a large number of previously built warships, obsolete. What are your thoughts on this subject? To an extent, I can agree with that, but not entirely. So yes, by her existence, Dreadnought did render pre-Dreadnoughts obsolete in, terms of what should you build for future warships. So in that sense, by resetting the naval power balance of what constitutes a modern battleship to 0, it meant that Germany had the potential now to try and catch up in a way that it didn't before, when everyone was looking at just sheer numbers of pre-Dreadnoughts, which Britain did have a huge advantage in. But there are a couple of factors you also have to consider. One of which is that for a good chunk of the Dreadnought arms race, pre-Dreadnoughts was still a major part of the battle fleet, because yes, Dreadnought might be in the water, yes, the Bellerophons and the St. Vincents might have come into the water, but you're still talking about less than 10 ships in a period when, the main battle fleet of a top-tier naval power might be in the dozens. So they were kind of a heavyweight punch, but surrounded by a lot of smaller ships, and if you'd taken just, say, the Bellerophons, St. Vincent's and Dreadnought herself up against the entirety of the High Seas Fleet at the time that those Dreadnoughts were the newest in commission, and the Germans had brought their own Dreadnoughts plus all of their pre-Dreadnoughts, then it would have been, a somewhat different scenario, just sheer numbers having their own weight. And, the Grand Fleet at the beginning of World War I still had the King Edward VII in as a battle squadron. Very shortly after this dismissed, but they were still there. So, whilst, yes, as I said, pre-Dreadnoughts were obsolete as in terms of what are we going to build in the future, at least for the first half of the Dreadnought arms race, they weren't completely obsolete. The Russians, for example, in Operation Albion, would show a pre-Dreadnought could still show some teeth. They still had what at least again for the first half of the race, pretty decent guns and decent enough protection. They were a little bit limited in speed against some Dreadnoughts and obviously firepower, but then they had the numbers to make up for it. The other thing you have to bear in mind, so essentially what I'm making in terms of a point there is that whilst in terms of the newest ships, yes, Britain was a lot closer to parity with everyone else than they necessarily wanted to be, it's not quite as bad as that up until about 1910, 1911, because the pre-dreadnought still brings some punch to the field. After that, you start to get super dreadnoughts, and the pre-dreadnoughts really start getting left behind, as indeed to a certain extent to the very earliest dreadnoughts. But by that point, Britain was beginning to build a numerical superiority in dreadnoughts as well. So, 6 to 1.5 dozen the other there. But the other thing is that when you're looking at the start of the dreadnought race, if you consider the competitors, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, Britain, America, and even to a certain extent Italy, all in 1905 and 1906, Dreadnought herself is the one that starts the race, but it's a race in which a good chunk of the competitors are carrying their own starting pistol. The South Carolinas, the Satsumas, etc. These things were already in concept, in design, or in build at the time that Dreadnought commissions. So, whilst Dreadnought started it, if she hadn't, someone else was going to in the next year or two. So all that Dreadnought really does, apart from being the official start of the race, is it also technically gives Britain a slight lead in terms of they can start work on their second and third classes of Dreadnoughts around about the time that everybody else is starting on their first, which would give them an advantage, except for the fact that the British politicians who had approved the building of the first ship almost immediately, elections, change of government, etc., but broadly speaking, the British political establishment start the race and then almost immediately start hamstringing the Royal Navy's ability to keep up by limiting their budget, limiting the numbers of ships they can build, and that, probably more than anything, if you see the video I did on the Dreadnought arms race, is kind of the main factor as to why Germany's able to almost achieve parity in the first half of the Dreadnought arms race. It's the equivalent, if we carry on the analogy, to a race where 2/3 of the competitors have brought their own starter guns. The British competitor is the one who pulls his starter gun out first and starts the race with a slight heads up, only for his coach to almost immediately trip him over. And so he stumbles and has to catch up a little bit, and thus losing a good chunk of the lead he could have otherwise had. But there you go. Chief Eyeroll asks, follow up to the Admiral Byng Court Martial question in Drydock number 189, you outlined the Admiralty's contributions to the loss of Majorca and Byng's Court Martial, but what do you think of Admiral Lord Anson's involvement before, during and after the Court Martial? Anson is a difficult one to pin down because, in the context of this question, I've seen very reputable authors and historians argue both sides of this particular question. Now, on the one hand, if you want to paint things for Anson in a very positive light, you can point out that he was trying to reform the Navy, he was trying to update it, he was relatively successful in rooting out a large amount of corruption, streamlining processes, and so on and so forth. And in that context, and also the revisions to the fighting instructions that he made, which were kind of the proximate cause of why Byng was executed apart from anything else, were in part they were part of his reforms to try and encourage Royal Navy captains and admirals to be much, much more aggressive, because there had been a failure for them to be aggressive in earlier conflicts. So the change itself could be seen as a positive with unintended consequences, like the execution of Byng. So that's the positive way of portraying Anson would be to say, he was massively overwhelmed, overworked. He was trying to drag what was definitively a rather corrupt and occasionally cowardly Navy out of the doldrums and turn it into the force that would eventually, become famous as under admirals like, hit the contemporary in this time period, Hawke, and then later Nelson and so forth, would go on to be, the fearsome Age of Sail Royal Navy that we know of these days. And he was also, at the time of Byng's execution, struggling to deal with a massive French threat to the English Channel, which caused him to keep a lot of ships at home, and including most of the best ones. And so Byng, at that point, is kind of an unfortunate piece of crossfire that he probably couldn't do all that much to prevent. That's the charitable interpretation. The uncharitable interpretation is that Anson tried to do far too much, couldn't delegate enough, was basically went maybe perhaps a bit too overboard in some of his changes, and indeed the fighting instructions would be revised so you didn't have just only death as a penalty for the particular charges that Byng was brought up against. And you can also make arguments that perhaps he was a little bit too scared of the French in the Channel, and that he didn't do quickly enough to root out the corruption and the cronyism, etc., that beset the Royal Navy at the time. And ultimately, he was First Lord of the Admiralty, so the responsibility of sending Byng with too few ships and not well manned enough and not in good condition enough to actually do the job he was supposed to be doing, a lot of that ultimately, whether it be directly or indirectly, comes back to Anson's doorstep. So at that point, Anson is kind of, as much as anybody else, someone who holds responsibility for setting Byng up to fail. And then, obviously, as I've written the instructions, that meant there wasn't any way out of him being executed. And you can make arguments for every point of those in between those two extremes. Personally, I'm not a complete Anson apologist. I'm also not someone who hates him. He was generally a good naval officer, very talented, albeit that I would say as First Lord, some of the stuff he did, like the war on corruption and stuff, was very definitely laudable, but he also was not necessarily the most diplomatic or the most organised of First Lords. The charge of trying to do too much too quickly, if you caveat that with given the resources he had available to him, probably have a little bit of merit, although I personally would then also argue what else are you supposed to do? Delay extremely well needed changes to the Admiralty and the Navy in general just because some of those problems are causing shortages that are delaying you putting in the changes. It's kind of a bit of a circular logic. So yeah, I'm somewhat undecided on the matter. I probably lean slightly more in favour of Anson not being directly responsible for Byng being executed and the situation that led up to it, but perhaps having a degree of indirect responsibility, certainly. And then, of course, ultimately, once again, I'm left with being able to blame the politicians, although technically Anson was halfway house between a Navy officer and a politician at this point, but the politicians for having ticked off the king enough that the king didn't want anything to do with them, up to and including pardoning Byng. The Judge 2017 asks, why do Massachusetts, Alabama, and the Iowa-class battleships have enclosed bridges around the conning tower, but North Carolina does not? None of the battleships were built like this originally, so what was the reason the North Carolina did not get this modification while the South Dakotas and Iowas did? It's more to do with the relative locations of the conning tower and the bridge in the original designs as much as anything else. So this is the enclosed bridge of the North Carolina, as circa 2022. However, if you look at profile pictures of North Carolina, a South Dakota, and an Iowa back at the point that they were built, you'll see that North Carolina has fully enclosed bridge structures as well as an open area up top, but it's set back physically from the conning tower. There's more than 180 degrees of the conning tower forward before, and the conning tower is beginning to curve back before it intersects with the superstructure. If you then look at wartime photos of the South Dakota class, you'll notice that the superstructure is more closely enclosing the conning tower. It almost, it looks like if you take the conning tower as the fixed point, it appears as if the superstructure has moved forward a little bit. And thus you have this walkway, open walkway, that's built around the conning tower, which then later gets fully enclosed because the weather just makes it basically almost untenable to be out in an open platform. And then when you look at the Iowas, then at that point the conning tower is even more extensively engulfed by the superstructure, and this platform structure that is built around it higher up is even more extensive still than it was on the South Dakotas. So with the Iowas, even at the point that they're on trials, you basically just have to add some glazing. So effectively it's a case of, if there is any kind of substantial walkway dash enclosed area forward of the conning tower or wrapping around the conning tower, it does get enclosed. But with the North Carolinas, their superstructure, although it's not obviously completely divorced from the conning tower, it is the furthest set back, and thus there isn't a walkway installed when she's initially built for the ships for the to be then subsequently enclosed. Ferrata Victrix asks, what would be your pick for the warship equivalent of the Bob Semple tank? Now, people probably recognise the ship already and probably already getting very angry, but let me explain my choice. The thing is, whilst the Bob Semple tank is quite often derided as one of the worst tanks in history, and objectively fine, yes it is, I tend to view it in a slightly more favourable light, in as much as when you look at the context of the Bob Semple tank, you're asking New Zealand, a country that has never built a tank before and doesn't have any industry capable of building what would be considered at the time modern tanks, to build a tank. And it's in the middle of a war, so they're not going to get any help or assistance from the people they would normally look for help or assistance to. It's got to be entirely made with local materials, so it's kind of, yeah, it's not particularly good, but they tried, and were mainly hampered by the fact they hadn't done this before. And hence my choice is USS Maine, famously blown up at the start of the Spanish-American War. Now, the reason I put Maine in as the equivalent of the Bob Semple is that, having just explained where I see the Bob Semple, Maine fills almost exactly the same kind of situation. She is built by a nation that has never built a modern-ish warship before, massively hampered by the resources that are available to her, no particular design experience going into it, and so they come up with something that, it isn't really a very good armoured cruiser because it's slow. It's definitely not a good battleship because it's weakly armed and weakly protected. But they tried. They did their best, and they came up with something which could have had some marginal utility in a war with someone who actually knew how to shoot back. The Spanish-American War, not exactly a prime example of a peer-on-peer conflict, to say the least, but had Maine come across somebody with perhaps a slightly better navy in some form of early 1900s conflict, she's not going to hold up very well against actual battleships, and if more than one enemy armoured cruiser comes across her, she's probably got issues. But if she comes across a single enemy armoured cruiser and that armoured cruiser is obliging enough to come to her, she could have acquitted herself reasonably. And similarly, the Bob Semple tank. Yes, if even the somewhat questionable Japanese designs came ashore, it's not going to really do much good against them. But if a bunch of Japanese soft vehicles or infantry come alongside, she is, to a degree, bulletproof in places, and she has some weapons of her own, which are fairly nasty if used against soft vehicles and infantry, so she could have made a reasonably good accounting of herself there. So, there are parallels. And now watch the endless angry comments coming in. Swee420Den asks, would you ever consider pushing the timeline of the channel into the 1960s as a continuation of topics already explored, such as ending the river warfare series with the swift boats or expanding the damage control videos by talking about some of the major US carrier fires during the Vietnam War. I don't think so. As I said before, there is a line at 1950, and as I've said before, if a ship was built or largely planned before 1950, then I can continue to talk about her career after 1950. That only makes sense. But that's in terms of a fixed career. Other than that, as with something like, say, the Maltas, they are a ship that was never built, but would have been a pre-1950s vessel. And then their hypothetical potential for post-1950 can also be discussed because, hey, it's a hypothetical. No one can point at a hypothetical and say that didn't happen. Well, of course it didn't happen. That's why it's called a hypothetical. But once it comes to specific events or ship classes that are post-1950, the channel still has a rule of no, we don't cover these things. For the reasons I've elucidated multiple times before. So the swift boats, they're not in any way, shape or form connected other than in doctrine to pre-1950 stuff, so somebody else can cover those. And with things like the Forrestal fire and so forth in obviously post-1950s, one, the technology is very different. Two, the threats are very different. I mean, you don't have to worry about, by and large, jet fuel fires in a pre-1950s carrier, apart from right at the very end, and so on and so forth. So, I could probably, in theory, talk about the Forrestal fire, but that would be, I think, putting just a little bit too much of a crowbar in the door of opening the topics for discussion to other things post-1950, which I definitely don't want to do. With the big caveat, as I've mentioned before, that if somebody who was actually there wants to come and talk about it, I will quite happily give them the floor. We've seen the Suez campaign through the eyes of somebody who was there. With Captain Sequest, we've seen the Iowa service in the 1980s through the eyes of someone who was there. If someone was on Forrestal and would like to be interviewed, or someone knows someone who was on Forrestal who thinks they might be up for an interview, and they're happy to talk about what they saw, what they did, lessons learned, etc. I mean, obviously, if someone was just in the engine room and heard everything happening above them, it's not going to be that relevant, but still might be interesting to hear about in more general terms. Or a subject matter expert, for that matter, also someone who's studied the Forrestal fire in depth, wants to talk about it. Those people I will be perfectly happy to give a platform on the channel to, because at that point, they're the ones with the expertise. So, if someone who was there says this is what I saw, there's not really any arguing with it, because that's what they saw. And if someone who studied it, something like the Forrestal fire in considerable depth, says, this is what I think happened and this is how the US Navy responded, they've done the research. You wanted to argue with it, take it up with them. But broadly speaking, when it comes to stuff that's post-1950, unless it's an inarguable thing like this ship served in this conflict, it's kind of where I draw the line on my expertise. If somebody wants to get down and argue about the definition of pre-dreadnoughts or the metallurgy of face-hardened armour steel, I will quite happily do that till the cows come home. If somebody tells me, a Zuni rocket has this capability as opposed to this book which says this has the other capability, I'm just putting my hands up and going, okay, not qualified for this argument, really. And that brings us to the end of the video for this week. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. There are a few minor updates to the Canada trip, which, of course, is happening in less than a week from the time that you're listening to this, assuming that you're listening to it something close to release day. So this is the schedule, tentatively speaking. It's mostly locked in. I know I verbalized it earlier, but I'll explain a few things on here. This, as you might guess from the background, is taken from Naval History Live because Dr. Alexander Clark is also making the trip. This is a joint trip. As you can we have a day agenda and we have an evening agenda. Dr. Clark is arriving in Canada on Thursday the 2nd. I'm arriving on Friday the 3rd. So Dr. Clark will be aboard Haida on the Friday, whereas I will be somewhere in the skies over the Atlantic and hopefully not coming down in a ball of flames. Now, on Saturday, we will be aboard Haida, pretty much opening till close. So, we will be filming. So, similar rules to what happened when I was in the US will apply. So, if you happen to see us wandering around Haida, feel free to say hi, etc. But we will be doing filming during the morning and into lunchtime. So, please do try and respect that. But as soon as we're done with the filming, then obviously feel free to come and have an extended conversation, etc. And on the day, probably via Twitter and Discord, we will announce, at a time to write, okay, we're going to be here at X location until the ship closes. So, have fun and track us down a bit easier. Yes, as you might see in the evening agenda, there is a dinner with Canadian fans. So if you are planning on showing up on Saturday the 4th in the evening, we are trying to organise some form of dinner at a local restaurant. I think we currently have something along the lines of around about a dozen people lined up. But if you are going to be there and you do wish to take part in that, which obviously there'll be even more extended time to chat generally, then, well, probably best to let Dr. Clark know via his Discord server, although you can also Discord message or email me as well, and I can pass it on to them, as Dr. Clark and company are doing most of the organising for that. Then, obviously, as you can see on Sunday, we have a spare day. If the weather on Saturday is awful and we can't do a lot of exterior filming on Haida, then we have Sunday to do that filming. Otherwise, we'll either be heading off to the Canadian Aviation Museum or Niagara Falls, or both. Apparently, Dr. Clark wants to go to a Blue Jays game in the evening. I will probably relax. Monday, we will now confirmed we will be going down to Buffalo to see the Sullivans and the Little Rock. So that's another opportunity to come and say hi, albeit obviously, you probably have to see us on the Little Rock or ashore because the Sullivans is still recovering. Potentially there's a lecture going on of some description, but we don't have that confirmed yet. We're still waiting on confirmation for where and when that will be. Tuesday, we're heading over to Halifax. We're leaving basically the entire day for that. Yes, I know it's only a 3-hour flight, but that's our choice. Wednesday, we'll be visiting and filming on HMCS Sackville. So, again, feel free to come and say hi. Similar rules to Haida. Thursday, we will be at the Canadian National Archives, because if you're going to fly across the Atlantic and you have some spare time, why not? Also seeing the Museum of the Atlantic. And then in the evening, we have to head back to Ontario-Hamilton. Friday, the 10th, we're on Ojibwa, the submarine, as I mentioned last week. Again, you're welcome to come and say hi. We will be meeting, greeting people, etc., etc. But please, please, please do so when we're outside the submarine, because, yeah, an O-class submarine is not the most wide open of environments. So we'd end up blocking passages if, 3 people show up. The bit where it says I fly back to the UK on the 10th is inaccurate, thanks to some changes in flight with WestJet. I will still be there on the 10th and the 11th. There's a possibility of another lecture on the Saturday evening. But again, with the public lectures, we don't know if, when, or where they're happening yet. I know, yes, that's very close to call it at this point, but it is what it is. Not entirely in our hands. And then Sunday, we actually do fly home overnight and fetch up in the UK on Monday the 13th. So, that is the schedule. I hope to see some of you around. And thanks very much once again for listening to yet another Drydock episode. And I'll see you again in another video.